People like you don't sit in first class." The sentence landed like a slap across the boarding gate. Loud, certain, designed to humiliate. The woman in navy uniform didn't lower her voice. She pointed straight at the black man in the tailored suit as if her finger alone could erase his presence. Around them, the terminal fell into that heavy kind of silence that isn't silence at all. Phones clicking up, whispers rushing, passengers holding their breath to see what came next. He didn't move. One hand gripped a slim leather briefcase, the other held his phone calmly to his ear. His face didn't twist or break. He let her words echo through the air while his stillness made them uglier, sharper, impossible to disguise as protocol. "Show me your real ticket," she demanded. The security officer at her side stepped closer, palm brushing his holster as though this quiet man in a blue tie was already a threat. A murmur rippled through the line. A young woman clutched her carry-on tighter. A man in a hoodie whispered to his friend, "She just said that out loud?" His friend raised a phone, red light blinking, catching everything. The black man finally lifted his eyes, calm, unwavering, steel behind them. But he said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence cracked louder than her voice. Passengers leaned forward in their seats. Some frowned. Some smirked. One child whispered, "Mom, why are they yelling at him?" The mother pulled her close and said nothing. The uniformed woman pressed harder, voice shrill now, cutting through the glass and steel of the terminal. "You think that suit fools anyone? Step away from this line before we have you removed." Every word was an accusation. Every syllable a verdict passed without trial. And yet the man stood anchored, his presence refusing to bend beneath the storm swirling around him. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. And we're glad you're here. Now, back to Marcus. He breathed once. Steady. The phones around him kept rolling, capturing a man whose calm threatened to expose every crack in the system. He was not yelling. He was not pleading. He was simply waiting. And in that waiting, the power in the room began to shift, though no one knew it yet. Marcus Carter walked into Gate B-14, dressed with a precision that never shouted. A charcoal suit, crisp shirt, no flashy watch, no entourage trailing behind. Just a slim briefcase and a boarding pass tucked neatly in hand. He wasn't there to be recognized. He was there to be tested. To the staff, he looked like a man who wandered too far into a world reserved for others. To him, it was familiar ground. He'd flown this route 100 times. He'd sat in the very seat they now swore he could never touch. He didn't show his resume. He didn't need to. CEO, billionaire, shareholder of the very airline that had just branded him an intruder. But for now, he let them believe what they wanted because sometimes silence tells the loudest story. The uniformed woman stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "That ticket can't be real. Men like you don't pay for 2 amperes. Her words weren't doubt. They were judgment, pressed flat as policy. Marcus didn't rise to it. He lifted his phone, spoke softly into the receiver. Whoever was on the other end answered in a clipped, efficient tone. Passengers nearby leaned in, trying to catch the exchange. They couldn't. The words were quiet, but the calm in his voice carried weight. Then came the second blow. A man in a navy blazer, shift supervisor, eyes sharp with borrowed authority, strode in. His shoes tapped the tile like a gavel striking down. "Sir, this area is for premium clients only. You'll need to step aside before we involve airport security." Phones tilted higher. The recording lights multiplied. The boarding gate no longer felt like a checkpoint. It felt like a courtroom. Marcus remained still. The only movement, a slow blink, a subtle breath. That restraint was its own defiance. The supervisor frowned. He was used to anger, protest, noise. Not this. Not a silence that unsettled more than shouting ever could. So he pressed harder, voice louder. "Step back, sir. Don't make this harder." Passengers shifted. A college kid whispered, "But his ticket scanned green, didn't it?" His friend shrugged, eyes fixed on the unfolding storm. And then the insult became an action. The boarding pass was snatched from Marcus's hand, torn clean in half, tossed toward the floor like trash. Gasps erupted. A woman near the window clapped her hand over her mouth. A child whimpered, asking again, "Why are they yelling at him?" Marcus's gaze didn't break. He bent only slightly, retrieved the torn stub, and laid it flat against his palm. No anger, no panic, just a quiet resolve that made the uniformed woman falter for a heartbeat. But the supervisor, blinded by his own certainty, barked the order that tipped the room into chaos. "Security, escort him out." And with that, the storm surged closer. The command to escort him out hung in the air like smoke. The security officer stepped forward, hand brushing against Marcus's arm, ready to drag him from the line. The crowd tensed. This was the moment most people cracked, raised their voices, pleaded, or lashed out. Marcus did none of it. He simply adjusted the cuff of his sleeve, as if the officer's touch was nothing more than static in the air. His stillness unsettled everyone watching. The gate, once filled with idle chatter, was now charged with murmurs. "This doesn't feel right," someone whispered. "He hasn't even raised his voice." A teenager lifted his phone higher, capturing every second. Then came the first flicker of conscience. A young trainee flight attendant, no older than 22, stood frozen a few feet away. Her badge tilted awkwardly, her hands shaking against the hem of her jacket. She'd watched the scanner flash green when Marcus checked in. She knew his ticket was valid, but protocol and fear held her tongue. Beside her, a passenger in a red hoodie muttered, "That's not fraud, that's profiling." His voice carried just far enough to be picked up by someone else's recording. Marcus's eyes swept the room once, then settled forward again, calm, unyielding. He had seen this scene before, different faces, different uniforms, same verdict. At 27, applying for a loan, the officer who told him, "Men like you don't qualify." At 35, negotiating an acquisition, the broker who whispered, "You don't look like an owner." Now here again, at 48, with billions under his signature, the words hadn't changed, only the stakes. The security officer tightened his grip. "Sir, let's not make this worse." Marcus's response was silence. His lack of resistance wasn't submission, it was indictment. Every second he remained still was a mirror reflecting the ugliness of the scene. That mirror caught fire when another witness stepped forward. A woman seated near the window rose to her feet, phone already recording. "I saw his ticket," she said loud enough for the row to hear. "It's scanned. I watched it." The uniformed supervisor snapped at her. "Ma'am, sit down. This doesn't concern you." Her reply was simple, sharp. "It concerns all of us." The gate stirred. More phones rose. More whispers turned into words. The crowd was shifting. What began as spectacle was becoming solidarity. Marcus didn't smile. He didn't move. He let the tide rise on its own. And in that moment, the power at gate B14 began to tilt, not because he shouted, but because others finally did. The supervisor's jaw clenched. He wasn't used to pushback, especially not from passengers. The woman's voice, steady, undeniable, made the air crackle with defiance. His answer came sharp, like a whip across the gate. "He is not a premium client. People like him buy discount tickets, then sneak into first class. This is a scam." Gasps erupted. His words weren't procedural, they were venom, sprayed loud enough for every camera in the gate to catch. The trainee flight attendant froze, her lips parting in shock. She had heard rumors of bias among senior crew, but this was no rumor. This was happening in plain sight. She took half a step forward, then stopped, fear tugging her back. Marcus remained silent. His hands rested lightly on his briefcase, his phone still in his grasp. Not a muscle flinched, but his eyes, calm, unblinking, met the supervisor's, and in that steady gaze, a quiet threat lingered. A man in the boarding line muttered, "That's crossing a line." His friend nodded, phone angled higher. "It's already on TikTok," he whispered. The supervisor, sensing the crowd's shift, only raised his voice further. "Escort him out now. This airline has no tolerance for imposters." And the security officer gripped Marcus's arm more firmly. But the moment his fingers tightened, a teenager near the window shouted, "Stop! He didn't do anything!" The cry carried like a spark, igniting murmurs into voices. A mother stood with her young daughter, her voice cutting through. "My child just asked me why you're yelling at him. What do I even say to her?" The supervisor turned, exasperated. "This is none of your concern." But it was too late. Concern had already spread. Phones tilted. Passengers spoke louder. The gate wasn't siding with authority anymore, it was siding with justice. Marcus didn't intervene. He let it unfold. Every second of restraint was strategy. Every breath of silence was proof. He wasn't fighting for a seat. He was forcing the truth into the open, letting it choke those who tried to bury it. The trainee's hands trembled. She glanced at Marcus, then at the torn boarding pass still in his palm. She whispered, barely audible, but her lips formed the words. I saw it scan green. She hadn't spoken loud enough yet, but the tide was moving toward her, and soon silence would no longer be an option. The tension cracked. The trainee flight attendant's whisper was no longer enough. She took a breath, stepped forward into the open, her voice trembling but loud enough for the gate to hear. I saw it. His ticket scanned green. Every phone light shifted to her like spotlights. The crowd leaned in. The supervisor's face flushed, red creeping up his neck. Step back, he barked. You're out of line. But she didn't retreat. Her voice steadied. What's out of line is tearing up a valid boarding pass and calling security on a paying passenger. The words landed heavy. A ripple spread through the crowd, murmurs turning into a wave of agreement. Someone clapped once, sharp. Another voice rose. She's right. Marcus still hadn't moved. He remained the still point in the storm, but now the storm was no longer against him, it was against those who had lit it. The supervisor spun toward the passengers, his voice booming, You're being manipulated. This man is a fraud, and anyone defending him is interfering with federal boarding protocol. That word fraud struck like a weapon. It echoed across the gate, seeping into the phones, recording, into the live streams already spreading online. And then another voice cut through. A middle-aged woman near the glass window, phone raised high. Fraud? He hasn't even raised his voice. You did. We're all watching. The supervisor faltered for the first time. His authority, once absolute, was cracking in real time under the gaze of dozens of witnesses. The security officer glanced between Marcus, the crowd, and his supervisor. His grip on Marcus loosened slightly. Doubt had entered the uniform. The trainee pressed further, courage flooding her words now. You don't get to erase him just because he doesn't look like your idea of first class. That was the moment the crowd erupted. Cheers. Applause. Phones lifted higher, capturing not just confrontation but conviction. Marcus lifted his eyes at last, scanning the sea of witnesses who had found their voices. His silence had been enough. Now, others were speaking the truth for him. The supervisor shouted desperate, Security! Remove all of them if you have to. But the tide had shifted, and it wasn't just Marcus standing anymore, it was the entire gate. The gate was no longer calm. It pulsed with voices, cameras, tension, and that pressure drove the supervisor over the edge. You all think this man belongs here? He shouted, his voice cracking under the weight of the crowd. He pointed at Marcus like he was an exhibit. Look at him! That suit, that briefcase, it's an act. You don't just walk into first class looking like that unless you're running a con. Gasps rippled. His words weren't subtle anymore, they were raw, dripping with contempt. A woman near the boarding lane hissed, That's racism, plain and simple. Her voice made the crowd stir louder, angrier. The supervisor didn't care. He doubled down, pulling the landline from the counter with a snap, punching in numbers with shaking fingers. Airport security now. We have a disruptive individual at gate B14. Possible fraud. Escalate. The phrase possible fraud carried like poison through the air. Phones tilted higher. A teenager whispered into his live stream, He just called in backup. This is about to get ugly. The trainee flight attendant stepped closer to Marcus, shaking her head. This isn't right, she muttered. Her voice trembled, but it was enough for the nearest passengers to catch. Marcus didn't move. He let the storm rage, his stillness a blade cutting through the noise. The security officer shifted uneasily. Sir, he muttered to the supervisor, he's not resisting. This could blow back. Do your job, the supervisor snapped. He's trespassing. But the crowd wasn't buying it anymore. A man in a business suit raised his voice. Trespassing? He had a ticket. You tore it up. The words landed like a verdict. The crowd roared in agreement. The supervisor's face drained of color, then flushed red again, rage boiling over. You're all being deceived. He doesn't belong here. He never will. The insult wasn't just at Marcus anymore, it was at everyone who dared defend him. A young mother pulled her phone close, speaking into the camera. We're watching a man get profiled, live, in front of dozens of witnesses. This is bigger than a seat on a plane. And in that truth, the supervisor lost the last grip of control he thought he had. The supervisor's voice snapped like glass under pressure. Enough of this circus. He shoved the landline aside and lunged forward, ripping the torn boarding stub from Marcus's palm. You see this? Fake. Worthless. The gesture was theatrical, meant to humiliate. He crushed the stub in his fist, then hurled it toward the floor. The crowd gasped. Phones caught every frame. The security officer stepped in, voice firmer now. "Sir, we need you to exit this area, immediately." His hand pressed against Marcus's shoulder, edging toward force. The trainee flight attendant blurted, louder than she intended, "Stop! He's done nothing wrong." Her voice cracked, but it rang through the gate like a bell. The supervisor spun on her, spitting the words, "You want to lose your job today? Keep talking." But she didn't back down. "Then fire me. I won't lie for you." The crowd erupted. Cheers, claps, voices chanting, "Let him board, let him board." Ugh. The supervisor's desperation turned ugly. He pointed at Marcus, his finger trembling with fury. "This man is a thief. He's here to steal from all of you. If we don't remove him now, this flight is at risk." Passengers booed. A businessman near the window shouted back, "Risk? The only risk is your mouth." But the supervisor pushed harder, his voice hoarse, frantic. "Officer, remove him by force if necessary." The security officer hesitated. Cameras surrounded him like a jury. His authority, once simple, now felt like a trap. Still, he placed both hands on Marcus's arm, ready to drag him toward the exit. Marcus lifted his head slowly, eyes locking on the officer. Calm, steel. His voice, low but razor-sharp, "Touch me again and this airline will pay for it." The officer froze, not because he believed Marcus's threat, but because of the unshakable certainty behind it. The crowd exploded gasps, whispers, phones shaking and raised hands. This wasn't the sound of a man bluffing. It was the sound of truth waiting to reveal itself. And for the first time, even the supervisor's face betrayed doubt. The boarding gate had become a theater. Cameras hovered like searchlights, capturing every flicker of tension. The supervisor's words still hung in the air, but Marcus was already moving. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his phone. His voice cut through the noise, calm and unshaken. "Rachel, Protocol 6. Activate it now." Ugh. On the other end, his assistant's voice answered instantly, clear and efficient. "Understood, sir. Board has been alerted. Compliance is standing by." The supervisor barked a laugh, brittle and forced. "You think a phone call makes you legitimate? He's bluffing." He turned to the passengers, searching for approval. None came, only more cameras, more red lights staring him down. Marcus remained anchored, phone still to his ear. "Log this incident. Every word, every action. Real-time documentation. I want it escalated." Rachel's tone sharpened. "Already underway. Live audit is recording. Multiple employees flagged for discriminatory conduct. Do you want me to patch the board through?" The supervisor's smirk faltered. The crowd stirred. Someone whispered, "Wait, patch through the board." "What board?" The trainee flight attendant stepped closer, courage rising with each second. "He's not bluffing," she said, voice trembling but resolute. "I've seen his name. He's not just a passenger." The supervisor snapped at her again, voice shrill. "Silence, or you'll regret it." But his threats were unraveling. Every insult, every order had been caught on a dozen live streams. The gate was no longer his stage, it was his downfall. Marcus lowered his phone slightly, his words steady, audible for all. "You accused me of fraud. You called me a thief. You tried to erase me in front of witnesses. And now, you will answer for it." Ugh. Rachel's voice returned, firm as steel. "Confirmation. The compliance board is live. They are monitoring this call. Do you want to proceed with escalation?" Marcus's gaze swept the gate, every passenger, every raised phone, every trembling staff member caught in the tide. His silence held for one more breath. Then, "Yes, proceed." The crowd erupted in murmurs, half in awe, half in confusion. This was no longer just about a seat. Something larger was unfolding, something the supervisor had no power to stop. And with that single command, the balance of control shifted. The air inside Gate B14 thickened, every breath charged with anticipation. The supervisor still tried to cling to authority, his voice cracking under the weight of the crowd. "This is nonsense. He's a liar, a scammer with a phone, nothing more." But Marcus finally moved. He lowered the device, letting his calm words carry farther than the man's shouting ever could. "My name," he said, voice measured, "is Marcus Carter." The supervisor blinked, scoffing. "So what? Doesn't change a thing." Marcus took one deliberate step forward. His tone sharpened, slicing through the tension like steel. "Owner of 25% of this airline, your airline, and every second you've spent humiliating me here," he paused, sweeping his eyes across the raised phones, is already logged, recorded, and witnessed. Silence detonated across the gate. Gasps, murmurs, disbelief. The trainee's mouth fell open. A man in line whispered, "Wait, Marcus Carter? The billionaire?" Another passenger checked his phone, pulling up a headline with Marcus's face on Forbes. The crowd shifted from witnesses to jury, from jury to believers. The truth hit like a wave. The security officer's grip vanished instantly, his hands retreating as though burned. His eyes dropped, shame heavy in the silence. The supervisor's face drained of color, his bravado cracked, his voice faltering. You can't prove that. You're bluffing. He's bluffing." But Marcus didn't need to shout. He simply lifted his phone again. Rachel's voice rang clear through the speaker, amplified by the hush in the room. "Verification complete, mister. Carter is confirmed shareholder and executive authority over Horizon Airlines. Compliance board is listening live." The gate erupted. Gasps became cheers. Whispers became roars. Phones shook in trembling hands, already streaming across TikTok, Instagram, and beyond. Marcus turned his gaze back to the supervisor, his voice steady but absolute. "You tore up the ticket of the man who signs your paycheck. You called me a fraud in a company I own. You mistook silence for weakness. That was your last mistake." The words didn't just drop, they landed like judgment. The crowd cheered, some clapping, some chanting his name. The supervisor stumbled back, the walls of arrogance collapsing around him. For the first time that morning, Marcus smiled. Not wide, not triumphant, just enough to let everyone know control had shifted, permanently. The gate dissolved into chaos, not the kind born of noise, but of realization. Truth had dropped like a stone in still water, and the ripples were everywhere. The supervisor stumbled backward, his lips moving but no sound forming. His voice, once so loud, had abandoned him. His authority collapsed under the weight of 3 simple words: Marcus Carter, owner. The uniformed woman who'd first screamed at Marcus fumbled with her badge, her hands shaking. He never said," she stammered, her voice drowning in the wave of murmurs. A passenger snapped back. "He didn't need to. You judged him before he even spoke." The security officer who'd held Marcus's arm lowered his eyes to the floor. His shoulders sagged. Every ounce of borrowed authority evaporated. For a long moment, he looked like a man realizing he was on the wrong side of history, and that the footage would prove it forever. The trainee flight attendant? She stood taller now, chest rising with a rush of vindication. Her voice rang clear. "I told you. His ticket scanned. You erased him because you wanted to." Applause erupted around her. Passengers filled the silence with fury and support. Phones hovered like lanterns in the dark, recording every twitch of guilt across the faces of the crew. A man in a business suit shouted, "You owe him an apology." Another added, "No, you owe him your jobs." "Oh." The mother who had shielded her child earlier lifted her phone toward Marcus, speaking into the lens. "This is how you treat the man who owns your company. The world needs to see this." The crowd had become more than witnesses, they were defenders, a living wall between Marcus and the collapsing authority of the staff. The supervisor's voice finally cracked through, desperate, hollow. This is a misunderstanding." But no one believed him. The word misunderstanding had no power here, not against the phones, the witnesses, the truth. Marcus stood at the center, calm as stone. He hadn't raised his voice once, yet the entire gate now moved with him. And for the first time, the staff realized they weren't facing a passenger anymore. They were facing the man who owned the sky they flew in. The gate had flipped. Authority drained from the uniforms and bled into the crowd, into Marcus, into the silent gravity of truth. The supervisor's voice was now just static, brittle, and useless. He clung to fragments of power that no longer existed. Marcus finally raised his phone again. His tone stayed level, almost quiet, but in the silence that followed, it thundered. "Rachel, execute termination protocol. Effective immediately." Gasps rippled across the gate. Passengers froze, eyes darting between Marcus and the trembling crew. Rachel's voice came clear through the speaker, deliberate, unshakable. "Confirmed. Gregory Vance, terminal supervisor, terminated. Nicole Harris, lead gate agent, terminated. Access badges revoked. Compliance, lock engaged." A beat passed, then another, and then, beep. The supervisor's badge, clipped proudly to his blazer minutes earlier, lit red. The electronic lock pulsed once, then died. His access was gone, live, in front of the very passengers he'd tried to impress with his authority. He fumbled with it, pressing the chip to the panel beside the counter. Nothing. The gate beeped again, rejecting him a second time. Phones zoomed in on his panic, capturing his fall in high definition. Nicole, the uniformed woman who had started it all, reached for her scanner. Beep. Red. Dead. She stumbled back, the weight of realization crashing down on her. The crowd erupted, half in gasps, half in cheers. A businessman laughed incredulously. "He just fired them on the spot." Someone else shouted, "That's justice." The security officer, still standing closest to Marcus, looked down at his badge as if bracing for impact. Marcus's eyes shifted to him, calm, but piercing. The officer swallowed hard, his voice unsteady. "Am I included?" Rachel's voice returned, sharp as glass. "Pending review. Stand down." The officer exhaled in relief, dropping his grip completely. He stepped back, hands raised not in defense, but in surrender. The trainee flight attendant straightened, her fear replaced with fire. "I told you," she said to Nicole, her voice clear and unshaken now. "I told you he belonged here." Nicole's face drained of all pretense. I didn't know," she stammered. Marcus finally turned toward her, his voice even cutting. "You didn't care to know, and that's why you're finished." The crowd roared, clapping, chanting his name now. Phones shook in the air, broadcasting the collapse of arrogance to thousands, soon millions. Gregory, the supervisor, stripped of his badge, tried one last plea. "You can't just do this in public. We have rights." Marcus's voice cut through him like a verdict. "You tore up my ticket. You tried to erase my name. You called me a fraud in a company I own. Your rights ended the moment you used your power to humiliate instead of serve." Rachel's voice confirmed again, crisp and final. "Access credentials revoked. Legal notified. Incident archived. Immediate lockout complete." "Oh." Gregory slumped against the counter, his face pale, sweat dripping. Nicole covered her mouth with trembling fingers. Around them, the passengers' cheers grew louder. The boarding gate wasn't just a stage anymore. It was a courtroom, a place where judgment had already been passed, not by Marcus alone, but by every witness holding a phone. Marcus lowered his device at last, his eyes sweeping across the crowd. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply nodded once, a silent acknowledgement that justice had spoken. And in that moment, the crew's collapse was sealed, not with shouting, not with violence, but with the quiet, irrefutable power of truth and consequence. The gate was still trembling with energy, half applause, half stunned silence. Passengers pressed closer, phones raised like a constellation of red recording lights. The fallen staff stood pale and broken, badges useless on their uniforms. Marcus remained at the center, unmoved. He adjusted his cuff, lifted his briefcase, and stepped forward. The crowd parted instinctively, not out of fear, but out of reverence. A child tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mom, who is he?" Her mother whispered back, eyes fixed on Marcus. "The man who owns this airline." The words spread like wildfire, whispered row to row until it was no longer a rumor, it was fact, undeniable and echoing louder than any announcement over the PA system. Marcus stopped, just short of the boarding lane. He turned, not to the disgraced supervisor or the humiliated gate agent, but to the crowd, the true jury. His voice was calm, deliberate, every syllable cutting clear through the terminal. "You watched them tear up my ticket. You watched them call me a fraud. You watched them try to erase me because they didn't believe I belonged." He let the silence sit heavy for a moment, every phone capturing his gaze. But belonging isn't granted by arrogance. It isn't dressed in uniforms or hidden behind counters. Belonging is earned by truth and enforced by justice. A murmur of agreement rippled through the passengers. Someone whispered, "Amen." Marcus continued, steady as stone. "I didn't have to shout. I didn't have to beg. I didn't have to fight for what was already mine. Power doesn't need volume, it needs conviction." He lifted the torn stub from his pocket, smoothed flat against his palm. For a heartbeat, the room held its breath. Then he set it gently on the counter, right where Gregory had first tried to erase him. "This," he said softly, "isn't just a ticket. It's proof that silence, when rooted in truth, is louder than every insult." The crowd erupted in cheers, clapping, chanting his name. Phones shook with the energy of vindication. The trainee flight attendant wiped her eyes, standing taller than ever before. The security officer lowered his head, ashamed but respectful. Marcus turned toward the disgraced staff one final time. His words were precise, deliberate, a closing statement, not a debate. You mistook silence for submission. That was your last mistake. With that, he lifted his briefcase, scanned his replacement boarding pass, now reissued by Rachel remotely, and walked through the gate. The crowd roared, some passengers chanting, others filming the moment they knew would go viral within minutes. The humiliated staff shrank into the background, stripped not just of badges but of legitimacy. The trainee, emboldened, followed Marcus's path with her eyes, as though watching the future realign before her. The gate, once a place of humiliation, had become a courtroom of justice, and Marcus Carter had left his verdict without raising his voice. For everyone who had ever been told, "You don't belong," the answer now stood clear, echoing across every corner of the terminal. Yes, we do.